Thank you all so much for being here and for David for inviting me. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the land of the Noongar people, that their sovereignty was never ceded, and that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. So I wanted to start by telling you a story. So in a previous job at a previous institution, I was sitting in a research strategy meeting. The Dean of the faculty was new to the role, and he mentioned two areas that he wanted to see the school do better in. The first was putting in, and presumably winning, grants with colleagues in medicine and psychology. They had a lot more money at their disposal than, say, the social sciences, and so working with them would increase our grant money, our capacity to do things. Correct. About 10 minutes later, we'd moved on to publication outlets. And he said he wanted our members to only publish in ABDC A or A-star journals, preferably good A-star journals, preferably FT50 journals. Not only did that feel relatively transactional to our colleagues in medicine, but it's also just a bad policy. If you want to leverage the benefits of interdisciplinary research by accessing grants available to medicine, then you're going to be working in a team that will want to publish in their own journals, like at least some of the time. Saying do interdisciplinary research, but only if you publish in this extremely narrow set of disciplinary journals is not only a little bit draconian, but is a policy that isn't really going to get you anywhere. And this is the paradox of interdisciplinarity. So we are all interdisciplinary practitioners, right? The very act of doing or reading or working with economic history is an interdisciplinary one. We talk to people in different disciplines. We integrate knowledge from historians, from economists, from the business disciplines and others. Those are our inputs. Our outputs then communicate between those different domains. We, or the articles and books that we write, are the bridges that connect disciplinary silos, demonstrating the importance of an economics sensibility for historians, or say a historical approach for economists. And this is a good thing. In the face of increasingly disparate disciplinary silos, interdisciplinary integration and communication is more important than ever. We need interdisciplinary research. It's the source of innovation, of scientific breakthroughs, for creating job-ready graduates and useful real-world research. Climate change, global development, pandemics, and so on are infuriatingly complex and rarely respect disciplinary boundaries. I think, as we've all learned recently, responding to the COVID-19 pandemic has required not only understanding epidemiology, but also political science, economics, sociology, geography, and so on. We live in a very interdisciplinary world. And universities say they want this. I've just chosen a few casual, that's mine, that's ours. They have redesigned curricula to include cross-disciplinary instruction. They have statements on their website or in their research strategy about priorities and graduate outcomes. As interdisciplinary practitioners, I'm sure if you're anything like me, you've welcomed this lip service that something's felt a little off. You know, they say that we're doing things differently now, so why don't I feel supported in my work? The reality is that the structures of universities and the incentives for work and promotion still favour work published and produced within the tribe. Some of these structures run very deep. Hundreds of years of university policy has established the primacy of certain types of knowledge. Some of them are more recent, but in order to disrupt them, we would have to have some pretty serious conversations about how we fund university and what they're for. So this is the central tension. This is the real will they, won't they. Everyone wants interdisciplinary research, but very few understand how it's produced, and even fewer actively implement policies to encourage it. So who am I? What are my qualifications? Is this legal? Good questions. So this topic, this tension, is the subject of my new book. I have a few copies with me today if you're feeling that way inclined. I came from a background in economic theory and intellectual history, looking at the way that interpersonal connections affect knowledge. Okay. I was looking for a PhD topic, and I came up with the idea of studying the progress of economic history in Australia. Not as the work of great men, as it had been written, though there are lots of great men and great women in there, but as communities of practice. As I progressed further in the research, particularly the very long gestation that the book had, the lens became a lot bigger. Not just the work of great men, not just the work of communities, but of the structural incentives that support and encourage certain types of research. I do dunk on universities a fair bit, but I try to do so constructively to understand why universities are the way they are and why we appear to be so stuck on the sorts of policies that we can introduce. You'll hear me say several times today, no one's going to do it if no one has a job. So most of us work in or around universities, but have we ever really thought about what they are? What are they supposed to do? Universities are one of the most important organising structures for research, with the policies, programs and incentives allowing scholars to establish certain types of teaching and research activities. Universities structure the physical space where scholars interact, such as the placement of offices, the location of tea rooms and seminars. Universities determine the groupings, faculties, departments and so on, that match scholars with like-minded colleagues. So for example, is economics in your social sciences faculty or your business faculty? Universities also control cash. They decide who to hire, the incentives for funding and promotion, the degrees on offer. Universities are thus responsible for the overt barriers and the covert inconveniences that influence the way knowledge is produced. The underlying logic of universities has been centred around three distinct systems of learning, each with their own aim. So medieval universities in the UK and Europe were elite enclaves of learning tied to the clergy. So this is the English or the Oxbridge model of higher education, and it aimed to provide a common moral, intellectual and social experience for the ruling elite, with students grounded in general intellectual skills. The Scottish model was more secular, more egalitarian. Universities were there to serve the professions. Educators were responsible for imparting practical knowledge. Scottish-led universities placed an emphasis on academic disciplines as a way of organising knowledge into discrete, sort of well-understood categories. You master maths, you master science, you master geography. Finally, the German or Humboldtian model of higher education placed an emphasis on scientific training and research. The university professor in this system develops new knowledge, supervises postgraduate students with instruction at the undergraduate level, a secondary or a tertiary activity. The Humboldtian model strongly emphasises research at the frontier of siloed academic disciplines. And Australian universities combined these three systems of learning. The older sandstone universities, of which UWA is one, and there was one in each of the Australian colony capital cities, were established in the 19th and early 20th century on principles similar to the Oxbridge elite liberal arts education. However, very quickly, the Scottish model took over, and that has been more or less the prevalent model of higher education in Australia, with 19th and early 20th century tertiary education designed to prepare students for professional work. In the post-war period, mass expansion of higher education was designed along really similar lines. In the post-war period, we wanted to multiply the supply of skilled labour, particularly in the professions. Universities came to command a much greater space in professional work, and simultaneously, a much greater proportion of Australia's population was trained in professional work through universities. Post-war universities also incorporated the German model to some degree. The war had demonstrated the importance of basic primary knowledge and the way that this can be applied to lots of different situations. And so this became part of the compact of the establishment of new universities and the expansion of old ones. Governments began to fund a greater proportion of research through their universities, and the role of university workers expanded to include both professional instruction and research. And this is the birth of the 40-40-20 that we are very familiar with. The Australian National University, the ANU, was the only real Humboldtian university, with work at the institution consisting of frontier discovery and supervision of graduate students. Since the late 1980s, neoliberal reform has corporatised Australia's higher education system. While the underlying logic of universities, so professional education, frontier knowledge, has pretty much remained the same, principles of new public management has been introduced to encourage performance, apparently, through competition in new and expanded markets for students and research. So that's a brief history of Australian universities. And against that background, the main sort of narrative or story of the book is about an interdisciplinary field, Australian economic history. It's a small field that was at times bigger, wedged between the disciplinary juggernauts of economics and history, the humanities and the social sciences. Economic history is a good case study for this sort of thing because we have a lot of time to work with. It's one of the world's oldest interdisciplinary fields and has had a strong presence in most countries and nations and regions around the world. In 2011, for example, there were approximately 10,000 economic historians, 44 economic history societies representing at least 59 countries, of which our Economic History Society of Australia and New Zealand, Lionel's here today, is one of them. So the chapters are relatively chronological. I start with the early 20th century and the production of economic historical writing born from the collection of colonial statistics. And then partnership between government research, the Workers' Educational Association, and universities. Key scholars you may recognise, such as Timothy Coghlan, who's up here, Edward Shan, over here, and others like Brian Fitzpatrick, Douglas Copland, Robert Madgwick, Herbert Burton, and so on, worked across a variety of disciplinary groups and across those three institutions. This, what I call the tripartite structure, and the very porous boundaries between disciplines meant that the knowledge produced at this time was extremely interdisciplinary. It was diverse, it was very practical, and it integrated and communicated well, so it served that function. However, the field had virtually no collaboration, no professional structures, no real identity or shape, no collective action. So it was good for some things and not so good for others. In the immediate post-war period, within the context of the golden age of higher education that I described before, economic history experienced their Big Bang. Economic historians started arriving in Canberra to the research-only ANU in the late 1940s. And in 1951, they hired a 29-year-old Noel Butlin, who's there holding up the veranda. He soon began work on his major piece, what I like to call the numbers and the words. In the numbers, Butlin compiled Australian historical national statistics within a national income accounting framework. In the words, Butlin used these statistics to describe a sector-by-sector mechanism of growth in the latter half of the 19th century. He took cues from Coghlan's earlier proto-national income accounting, and he looked to capture and understand the Australian economy without a theoretical framework. However, his logic was a mixture of neoclassical individualism and Keynesian macroeconomics that was very common at the time. He emphasised market signals and the decision-making of rational economic actors. while also focusing on the duality of the public and private spheres and a broad acceptance of capital formation as the key engine of growth. So Butlin's big statement, arguably the feature that he's best known for, was that the Australian economy was important and interesting as a thing to study. Not as a footnote to the Industrial Revolution, not as a British outpost, not as subject to the vicissitudes of international trade. Butlin argued that urbanisation and domestic manufacturing, rather than its export markets, were the dominant industries in Australia from the 1870s. He argued that internal structural disequilibrium from speculation on the real estate market and inefficiencies in the railway construction business caused an initial downturn before the 1890s depression. So the depression was internally sort of prompted rather than developing through the bearing crisis overseas. Although Butlin acknowledged the importance of external factors, he writes, in his mind, they're not the most interesting or the most important ones. So Noel's contribution to understanding Australian economic history was remarkable. However, the institutional context enabled not only the production of the work itself, but also its promotion as an intellectual movement. It is hard to overstate just how much money the ANU had at this time. Butlin was able to hire a small army of junior scholars as research assistants or PhD students who were crucial in the production and promotion of these two works. They were either directly involved in data collection or they dealt specifically with matters Noel knew would be criticisms, things like the price series, the fact that he aggregated growth across the continent. This was the job of the juniors. Butlin's program was also congruent with and supported by both the economics and history disciplines in Australia, as well as key scholarship overseas in economic history, such as Simon Kuznet's National Income Accounting and economic historical work from the UK. I also look at a number of other contributions that emerged at the same time, things like Max Hartwell's work on Van Diemen's Land, Alan Hall's work on the London capital markets, that adopted a very similar approach to Noel, but were unconnected to him and to the ANU. So although Butlin was lauded as this totally new, totally fresh take on Australian economic history, his work, I think, was so successful because of its integration with and its similarity to what was going on elsewhere rather than its distinctiveness. I make the point somewhat cheekily that if it wasn't Butlin, I think it probably would have been somebody else with money and energy and things like that. Shortly after the publication of the numbers, Trevor Swan in ANU Economics granted Noel his insistence for a separate department, and through graduate supervision, seminars, joint projects and so on, he established a team or a centre for economic history in Australia. And the centrality of Canberra to the field has never really waned from that point. So this was the Big Bang, the work of what Chris Lloyd has called the orthodox school, that gave the field recognition, resources, identity and legitimacy, plus plenty of new material to debate and refine. So overlapping with this was economic history's moment in the sun. As part of the expansion of higher education and the general logic of fragmentation of universities, departments of economic history were established on the basis of basically compulsory undergraduate business and commerce subjects. Departments were kitted out with a God professor and maybe a half a dozen scholars, mostly those men who entered the job market in the late 60s and early 70s. Around 1980, the field, overnight, went into a hiring freeze. Growth of students in the post-war period had kind of taken off. Departments were full of scholars, unlikely to retire anytime soon, and universities and most public institutions were entering a period of audit and austerity. This was pretty unfortunate for folks entering the job market at this point, hi Lionel. But it also meant that we had groups of 6 to 12 people together with tenure and very little turnover for decades. So these small departments with relatively intense connections meant there was a real locational or spatial placement of ideas. In Canberra, the group integrated with the economics discipline and the clear metrics revolution that had made waves in the US. In Melbourne, a pretty kooky bunch of leaders encouraged a more diverse interdisciplinary research program. In Sydney, most were hired from overseas and continued to contribute to their global networks rather than conducting Australian research per se. A key exception being convict workers. There are also important heterodox perspectives, with the labour history and political economy crowds fellow travellers with economic history. So all of this was terribly exciting, except there was a fair bit of conflict. The clear metricians roasted the historians. Those in Sydney didn't really contribute to the society or the conference. The political economists ragged on the orthodox economic historians in print and in person. So even at the height of the field's professionalism and disciplinariness, the fragmentation between these small communities makes it so difficult to even discern a basic Australian approach to the subject. I tried, I really tried, and I couldn't do it. So after about 20 years of this, spatial placement of ideas, growth of departments and so on, we enter a period of resistance. There were existing vulnerabilities in the way that the field was organised, with fragmentation from the earlier era, meaning folks weren't super great at engaging in collective action or advocacy. The field had become very closely tied to economics overall, though due to departments was administratively separate. And that meant that the field was basically met with derision from economics, seen as a less rigorous subset, and ignored by history. Key leaders died or retired, and those remaining were a little conservative in their approach, with very little interest in meeting either of the parent disciplines at the new frontier that had emerged in the 90s. So against these existing and building problems, the Dawkins reforms, that's John Dawkins on the slide, introduced neoliberal market reforms to the higher education sector. The creation of revenue markets and accountabilities between units meant groups were forced to become territorial and competitive. Compulsory economic history subjects were amongst the first to be booted, and the resulting funding deficit meant that eventually all of the departments folded, with members leaving for business disciplines or remaining in economics. A few went to history. So at this point, there was a very real chance that the whole thing would collapse in on itself. However, economic history survived for doing it, in part because of leaning into the reasons for the crisis itself. The transition towards a neoliberal university forced members to broaden themselves professionally. Removing the protections of separate departments and other disciplinary structures forced members to look outwards to economics, to history, to the business disciplines, and to the world. Basically, they adapted, they survived. So there are signs of a moderate renaissance since the 2010s, the publication of big projects, increased engagement from parent disciplines and emerging scholars, and an increase in diversity of work and practitioners. There has been new interest and new work. However, several of the field's structures have been a little conservative intellectually, which meant that other more radical groups have popped up and have tended to bypass traditional structures in favour of their own. We also, in terms of challenges at least, we also still work in the global neoliberal university with the professional enclosure of tertiary education, university and journal rankings, particularly ERA, ABDC, and the ARC, still encouraging very disciplinary knowledge. So this has forced interdisciplinary groups like economic history to sometimes fall through the cracks of institutional incentives, or has encouraged certain members to hide or conceal their interdisciplinary identities. So it's very nice to be here. Here's our campus. Because Perth and the University of Western Australia have been a really key part of this story. Pamela Statham-Drew, who's here, was interviewed by for the book, and she gave really great insight into the way that the group at UWA developed. So at UWA, we had a small cluster of economic historians, around 4 or 5, though it's worth noting that that rivals some of the departments over east. Pamela was key, along with Mel Davies, Ian Vanden Dryzen, and Reg Appleyard. The group was very productive, with important work on the Swan River colony, convicts, mining history, labour, and demography. Members were based in economics, which, like their comrades in Adelaide, University of Queensland, Macquarie, Wollongong, and so on, created some challenges in terms of capacity building and professional identity. Pamela reflected on the challenges teaching general economic history subjects and giving seminars in an economics program as an economic historian, while also providing some really good opportunities for the integration of economic history with that parent discipline. And nowadays we have a real boom, I think, in economic history in Perth. We've got new people hired to history and economics groups, the establishment of the West Australian Economic History Network, hosting of the Summit for the 3rd year in a row, and of the APBH conference twice, and the new PP degree providing opportunities for new interdisciplinary conversations with members and with students. So I think it's probably a pretty good time to be an Australian economic historian. So the story of economic history in Perth, I think, is demonstrative of the opportunities we have in our field in the absence of departments. One of the things that happens quite a lot when people discuss economic history is that they say, oh, there used to be departments, now there aren't any, therefore the field is dead. It is deceased. Though Oxley and Meredith have conceded that, quote, the corpse still twitches. So in the book, I talk a lot about departments. I would consider them simultaneously the protagonist and antagonist of this story. So my first issue with departments, or more accurately with the focus on them, is that it is a little ahistorical. Departments existed in Australian economic history and a very small number of other countries, principally the UK, but very, very few other than that. And it was for a very short period of time. Most of the departments were set up in the 60s. The full suite was finalised in 1970, and they all started to close in the 1990s. The Tropes department, hilariously, was only operational for 2 years. Not only that, UWA demonstrates that there is a lot of economic history produced and a lot of economic historians outside of departments. Most of the major contributions to the field have been produced outside of departments. Anything by Coghlan, Chan, Fitzpatrick, Nolan, Sid Butland's major works, Ian McLean, Cambridge Economic History. All of this work was produced without the structure of the department, with authors embedded in an economics group, in a history group, or in Coghlan's case, in the government. My second problem with departments is that I don't think that they're that good for us. The reason they're advocated can be relatively surface level, in my opinion, something along the lines of, it was pretty nice to have that level of recognition and resources. And I'm not denying that it would be very nice, but it does assume that a discipline is the aim. And I don't think it considers fully the fact that economic history is interdisciplinary and should be treated as such. So while departments have been seen as the field's primary marker of success, I think they came with their own set of problems. The professional architecture of a department is designed to funnel communication and ideas inwards. Appointments, collaboration, teaching, seminars, and even the physical space are all designed to develop appropriate teams for disciplinary teaching and frontier knowledge. Folks know who they are, who they belong to. They are the economic historians. They have an identity distinct to larger groups such as economics or history. In Australian economic history, departments were generally small, with no more than a dozen appointments at any one time. The workforce was stable. Scholars obtained tenure at a young age during the sector's expansion. After this, there were very few new appointments, with very little mobility between groups. Each department had a God professor who was able to exert influence over the teaching and research program. And their physical space along a single floor or corridor encouraged close connections amongst the tribe. Activities associated with departments, teaching, joint projects, seminars, training of graduate students helped to reinforce these connections and created a sense of joint endeavour amongst members of each group. Disciplinary growth does come with an opportunity cost. A vibrant seminar program within the group means scholars are not able to attend seminars or events in other groups. Collaborations that deepen connections within the field reduces the time and energy that you have to develop interdisciplinary bridges. If scholars and students all emerge from a particular major, they will have a comprehensive understanding of that area at the expense of broader knowledge and networks. So in the case of Australian economic history, departments generally held their own seminars, and as a result, members rarely went to seminars in history or economics. Economic historians had their own courses, which meant they rarely, if ever, gave guest lectures or taught into other programs. Departments trained their own PhD students rather than engaging a mix of complementary supervisors. Some economic historians found departments uncongenial to their style of working. Jonathan Pincus, for example, has, quote, never been a fan of separate departments. McLean has similarly recalled the, quote, horribly fragmented institutional structure at ANU. Division of scholars into these small groups, in his words, restricted the flow of people and of ideas and led to a poorer grounding in either economics or history. Part of the reason that McLean accepted an appointment at the University of Adelaide was because they didn't have a separate economic history group. On the other hand, the complete absence of institutional resources, collaboration and shared ideas can lead to the dispersal or fragmentation of the field's members. This is what happened to some degree during the early 20th century, with satellite practitioners, all off kind of doing their own thing. It's certainly what happened in the period of resistance, with practitioners so concerned with their own survival and making themselves useful to their various parent disciplines that we have a missing generation of scholars. For example, we missed a huge chunk of the digital transformation in the 1990s and 2000s that has enabled big data research overseas, simply because we didn't have the man/woman power or the professional security to take on big digitisation projects at the time. So how do we move forward? What does this history tell us about how to conduct and support interdisciplinary research? The challenge as I see it is the same one the field has been grappling with the whole time. How do we maintain diversity, but also build capacity, relationships and identity? So the first thing I'd like to highlight is that if we are going to fulfill our interdisciplinary function, we need to consider the sorts of activities that we engage in. Activities, or the research things we do, are called communicating infrastructures. These are the places, events, ideas, methods that bring folks into the interdisciplinary space and facilitate that integration and communication. So things like a collaboration, a workshop, a journal, a publication, a theme, a curriculum, a conference. All of these can either reinforce connections within the tribe or facilitate interdisciplinarity, depending on how they're set up. So we are really in the weeds of policy design now. Hopefully you're still with me. So acknowledging that different activities lead to different outcomes in terms of knowledge, the main characteristic we need to look for is the constraint of the communicating infrastructure. How easy is it to enter the group, to move in and out? If there is a high barrier to entry, you're going to attract folks heavily committed to that area, so it will probably be a smaller group with more intense connections. Think of the level of commitment needed to be awarded and then take a new job, or to work with a co-author. On the other hand, activities with lower constraint, so more porous boundaries, lower investment of time and energy, will tend to attract those less committed to the area. Because of that lower commitment and corresponding commitments elsewhere, it's more likely that that person will have distinct or complementary knowledge or contexts. This is what is called the strength of weak ties, as Mark Granovetter has detailed from the sociology discipline. So remember, there is always opportunity cost. No one is only an economic historian anymore. David, for example, is about 5 things. We have to work with our relevant parent disciplines as well as within this interdisciplinary group, and I think that's okay. But capacity doesn't only look like departments. It doesn't only look like the Cambridge or us all publishing in the Australian Economic History Review, though I think you should. Activities with more flexible or porous boundaries that allow people to move in and out and around based on their competing responsibilities, I think, is the way forward. And from a policy design perspective, I really like events like today, where folks are members of their own departments or their own institutions, but we have a regular place to come together for events and workshops and conversations. Essentially, we've been doing this for years. I'm just legitimising it as a strategy. The second thing is, how do we know that we're doing a good job? What we choose to count in this space matters. Markers of success look different for interdisciplinary fields. They look really different to disciplines. But we need some markers in order to demonstrate our value to funders, to promotion committees, to our universities and so on. I make some suggestions about this in the final chapter. It could be measuring diversity of degrees or majors of those who take our courses. The fact that we might use history or economics to contextualise an otherwise pretty straight disciplinary subject. The range of affiliations of those who attend our events or collaborate with us in published work. The fact that we as practitioners are not simply attending the AHA or the Conference of Economists, but are agents in creating conversations and networks across those groups. It's important to remember that there's only so much agency that we have. We're academics, we're stretched, we're tired, it's an uphill battle. Most university policy and incentives still favour disciplines. But I think reflecting on where we do have agency or do not is an important step. I can't entirely control who enrolls in my courses. That's based on the majors and the degree structure. But I can control the amount of history they get, which at the moment is quite a lot. We can't control the ABDC rankings, but we can do things like rebrand the journal to better connect with our contributors and readers. I can't control the extent to which my work is congruent with the Conference of Economists, but I can invite folks from the Economic Society to my event. So I would recommend exploring the boundaries of that agency if you are able to. I'll leave you with this. Philosopher Karl Popper once said, quote, "We are not students of some subject matter, but we are students of problems. And problems may cut right across the border of any subject matter or discipline." The progress of Australian economic history demonstrates the unique features of interdisciplinary fields and the crucial position they occupy in the knowledge landscape, for solving major problems, training the next generation to be active and engaged citizens. I hope the book does justice to the field's extraordinary past and diverse futures. As Glyn Davis wrote for the blurb, I am tough-minded but optimistic, which I think is a pretty good description of me generally. My major hope for universities and for practitioners is that the book illuminates how we can create broad, vibrant, cross-disciplinary spaces as the key to ensuring economic history's continued value and relevance. Thank you.
Thank you so much.